Hello students, welcome to the 9th video lecture for Healthcare Ethics Fall 2020. This lecture covers Rachel Aviv's 2018 New Yorker article titled The Death Debate and Michelle Goodwin's 2018 article from the Hastings Center report titled Revisiting Death, Implicit Bias and the Case of Jahi McMath. The Hastings Center report is one of the premier journals in contemporary medical ethics. Okay? The New Yorker, as I'm sure you guys know, is a much more public venue. I have included a third article by Arthur Caplan, which was published in 2014, and it is about the same case. The title is The Case Against Care for the Brain Dead. A family's mix of hope, faith, and technology shouldn't blur the line between life and death. And it was published in Newsday, which is a newspaper, magazine newspaper thing, in January 10th of 2014. And it is up on the Blackboard site as a supplemental reading. You don't have to read it, but it's only like 2 pages long, and it helps explain the position of the mainstream bioethicists against Jahi McMath. Okay? So before I get into the articles, I'm going to talk a little bit about the final assignment for this course. So last week, I said that we'll have a final exam, much like the midterm, and a final written assignment, which is a bit like the group assignment you guys did earlier this semester. The final written assignment is an op-ed. So you are writing an opinion piece for a newspaper about a specific topic related to healthcare ethics. Not really for a newspaper, but as if you were writing for a newspaper, okay? It's due on Friday, December 11th. The assignment sheet for the op-ed is up under the Assignments tab on Blackboard. I will go over it in the Q&A session on Thursday. This week's worksheet asks you to do a bit of research for the op-ed assignment in preparation for writing it. I've asked you to find an example of an op-ed in a newspaper. Any number of newspapers and a whole lot of websites publish opinion pieces of the sort that I am asking you to write. In this week's worksheet, I gave you a couple of examples of major newspapers which are accessible through the York College Library, but you can feel free to choose any news source that you are familiar with. But you need to make sure that you are finding an opinion piece, not a news article. So this isn't something that's purporting to tell us facts about the week's news or the day's news, but instead it is expressing an opinion about current events. Remember that this is just an example. So the point is for you to get a sense of the genre. So you don't have to use this example as the grounds for your piece. Instead, your op-ed should be expressing your own opinions. But I'm asking you to find an example so you can see how these articles are written. So you have a sense of how you might do it, how you might express your own opinions about healthcare ethics for this assignment. Okay? So once you find your example, read it, and then on the worksheet, cite it so that I can find it and check to make sure that you're looking at the right kind of thing. And then write one sentence explaining why you chose it. All right, so moving on to this week's articles, I'm going to ask you guys to take a minute to consider Rachel Aviv's New Yorker article from a formal perspective. Okay, so now it's time to put your critical reading hats on. We are reading this article in part because it is an example of an op-ed. It is much longer than the piece that you will be writing, but it does several things that you're going to want to do. First of all, it tells a story. Second, it connects this story to larger ethical issues, most explicitly in the middle section on the history of brain death as a concept. And finally, it cites expert sources. So that's something that you're going to need to do in your assignment. Arthur Caplan's article, the optional reading for this week, is also an op-ed. It is much closer in length to the articles that you will be writing, and it's much more of a classic op-ed piece. It very clearly expresses the author's opinion on one key issue. And that's something you're going to have to do on your op-eds too. You're going to have to focus on one specific issue. But Caplan does some things that you don't want to do. His article is really bombastic in tone. So it's really aggressively written, and it doesn't cite any outside sources. That's because Caplan thinks he knows everything and doesn't need anyone to back him up, but he would have done better to have some sources backing up his argument, and you guys will need to do that too. The other article that you guys read for this week by Michelle Goodwin has a very different tone because it was written for a scholarly audience of bioethicists rather than a public audience. Yet it conveys important information for this class because it covers the concept of implicit bias. This is a concept that we have yet to consider, and it's super important because it is the main concept that bioethicists use to understand systemic inequalities in healthcare for patients. Okay, so much on the form, on to the content. What you guys are reading this week, this is the story of a teenage girl who died twice. Once in California and once in New Jersey. In 2013, an African-American girl from Oakland, California, named Jahi McMath, underwent a tonsillectomy as a treatment for sleep apnea. The surgery went well, yet the patient experienced significant post-operative bleeding. The family alerted the nursing staff and the attending physician to the patient's condition, but she continued to bleed until her heart stopped. By the time the medical team was able to restore her heartbeat and stabilize her breathing, Jahi McMath had experienced significant brain damage. She was declared brain dead, which in California means that she is legally dead. The hospital staff urged the family to cease artificial ventilation and allow Jahi to die physically as well as legally. The family refused. They got a lawyer involved and eventually got Jahi transferred from the state of California to New Jersey, which permits a religious exemption to the legal status of brain death. The state of California issued a death certificate on January 3rd, 2014. On January 5th, Jahi was admitted to St. Peter's University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Her mother, stepfather, and sister moved to New Jersey. Jahi remained on a ventilator for 4 years, first in a hospital, then in her family's new home. Meanwhile, her family mounted various lawsuits on her behalf against the hospital for malpractice and against the state of California to allow her to return home. In June of 2018, several months after Rachel Aviv's article was published in The New Yorker, the state of New Jersey issued another death certificate. Jahi died again from complications associated with liver failure. So, this strange case of double death relies on a distinction between brain death and cardiopulmonary death. Cardiopulmonary death is simple. The heart stops beating, the lungs stop working, the body dies. Brain death is complicated. It is a legal definition of death that evolved out of a bioethical definition, which declares the body dead when the brain ceases to function. It is, according to philosopher Peter Singer, who is quoted by Aviv on page 35, it is an ethical choice masquerading as a medical fact. The medical fact involved in brain death is the measurement of brain function. The ethical choice is whether or not the body dies without the mind. So why does brain death matter to bioethics? We will return to this question, but we can see that it matters by the vehemence of the responses from bioethicists in the case of Jahi McMath. So for example, in Arthur Caplan's op-ed, which is the optional reading for this week, he writes, "To keep Jahi's body on machines is ethically wrong because definitive brain death is death, and maintaining a corpse by artificial means is only slowing the inevitable decay and collapse of bodily remains." So you can see there that he's drawing on a set of medical assumptions about what will happen to the body as support for this ethical concept of brain death. He intones, continuing, "It is wrong for healthcare providers to treat someone who is dead. It is wrong for lawyers to ask judges to overrule medical expertise when it is doctors, not jurists, who know when death occurs. It is immoral in the extreme to not try to get Jahi's parents to come to terms with her death." So note his tone here, in addition to the content of what he is saying. He is arguing in defense of brain death, and he is very, very strongly supporting this concept of brain death. He is very, very worried about the challenge that the McMath family is posing to this concept. You guys might also note a number of authors that we have read in this course are cited in this article. So besides Arthur Caplan, who shows up in the article and is in this week's readings, Robert Truog and Thaddeus Pope, who we read earlier in the term, also show up in Aviv's article. Generally, the bioethics establishment sided with Arthur Caplan against the family of Jahi McMath in asserting that brain death is death. Okay, so what are the ethical issues at stake in Jahi's case? The first one is one that we read an article written by Thaddeus Mason Pope about, surrogate decision-making. So surrogate decision-making attempts to preserve patient autonomy when the patient has lost capacity. According to Pope, losing capacity does not mean losing autonomy. This is from page 1075 of the article we read earlier this term. Losing capacity does not mean losing autonomy. Our society's individualistic norms place such a strong emphasis on the value of the patient that medical decisions should continue to be guided by that voice as much as possible. Okay? So Jahi's mother acted as her surrogate decision maker when her daughter lost decision-making capacity. It was her responsibility to make decisions for her daughter as her daughter would have wished. In this case, Nyla, Jahi's mother, justifies her decision in her daughter's case based upon a mix of expressed wishes and substituted judgment. So if you look on page 36 of Aviv's article, which is page 7 of the PDF, in the top of the right-hand column, the article describes a conversation in which Nyla explained to her children what a ventilator is. She had been teasing them, saying, "I'm going to run your business for the rest of your lives." And when her son bragged that he'd outlive her, she joked, "Well, I'm going to get put on a ventilator." Jahi had never heard the word before and asked what it meant. "It's a machine that keeps you alive," Nyla explained. She told me, "I'll never forget." The rest of the kids laughed, and Jahi said, "Well, if something ever happens to me, make sure you keep me on one of those." So Nyla remembers her child's expressed wish to be kept alive on life support, and she insists that this is what Jahi would have wanted. So why did Arthur Caplan write, "Jahi's parents must be experiencing horrible pain, but their wishes for medical care should not be honored"? What overrules the principle of patient autonomy here? The answer is brain death. So if you guys read from pages 33 through 34 of the Aviv article, starting in the bottom right-hand corner, it says, Nyla asked Children's Hospital to perform a tracheotomy, which is a surgery that enables ventilator air to be pumped directly into the windpipe. And so this occurs when the family is trying to have Jahi moved after she has been declared brain dead. The hospital's medical ethics committee unanimously concluded that the intervention was inappropriate. They said, the medical ethicist at Oakland Hospital said, quote, "No conceivable goal of medicine, preserving life, curing disease, restoring function, alleviating suffering, can be achieved by continuing to ventilate and artificially support a deceased patient." So they said that the doctors and nurses caring for Jahi were experiencing, quote, "tremendous moral distress," and that accommodating the family's wishes would raise, quote, "significant concerns of fairness, of justice and fairness." Okay? So the hospital ethics committee, in encouraging Jahi's family to take her off the ventilator and refusing to perform a surgery that would allow her to be more safely transferred to another hospital where she could remain ventilator dependent, in refusing these things, they cite justice to back them up. So there are two versions of justice at stake here: social justice and distributive justice. Social justice is the kind of justice that Jahi's family argues for when they say that they have been discriminated against by the hospital on the basis of their race. Distributive justice is the kind of justice that the hospital ethics committee cites when they refuse to honor Jahi's family's wishes. According to the ethics committee, Jahi is using scarce resources that should be given to other patients. You are going to need this for your worksheet, okay? So if you are confused on this point, I suggest you rewind the video a little bit here and listen to that again, all right? And think about the argument for the distribution of healthcare resources based upon the capacity to benefit. Right? We learned about this when we read that article on justice earlier in the term. Jahi, according to this argument, has no capacity to benefit from artificial ventilation because she's dead. She's declared brain dead, okay? And that means she's dead legally in the state of California, and ethically from the perspective of most bioethicists. So why do bioethicists care so much about brain death anyways? The answer is that it is a necessary component of the current understanding of distributive justice. The primary argument of bioethicists in this case is that healthcare resources are finite and should be distributed to those who can benefit from them. So Caplan worries that other families will follow the actions of the McMath family, and then hospitals will be overwhelmed with ventilator-dependent, brain-dead patients who will take years to die. And this is in fact what was happening. If you read in the middle section of the Aviv article, this is what was happening when the technology of ventilators was first developed, and then the concept of brain death was developed in order to deal with this problem of all of these brain-dead patients who were taking up immense amounts of space and resources in hospitals. Okay? So Caplan writes that it's not cheap to occupy a bed in an intensive care unit at as much as $75,000 per day. So the chance that more beds might be occupied by the dead, surrounded by families armed with court orders waiting for miracles, would add stress to already overstressed hospitals. This worry shows up in several readings and several times in the readings that we did for this week, and not just in regard to ventilators or ICU beds. Thaddeus Pope is quoted by Aviv as saying, quote, "Every hour of nursing time that goes into one of these dead patients is an hour of nursing time that didn't go to somebody else." So there is also concern that Jahi's medical bills were being paid by Medicaid, which is a government-funded program with limited resources. However, there is a lot of room for racial discrimination in this article, in this argument, right? So this vision of distributive justice that says Jahi McMath should not be kept alive on ventilators, that it is a failure of justice to do so, there is a lot of room for racial discrimination in that argument, as we will see when we get to Goodwin's article. But the other concern that bioethicists have in this case is organ donation. So the other thing that we haven't talked about very much in this course, this concept of organ donation, it's a favorite issue for biomedical ethicists because it is actually, it sets up these test cases that are sort of really complex in the way that ethicists like to talk about. But organ donation is actually a really minor part of our contemporary healthcare systems. So it's not really a big deal, but it is an important component of super fancy medicine, okay? And the concern here is that disregard for the concept of brain death will cause surrogates to decide against donating the organs of brain-dead patients because it creates a false hope of miraculous recovery. So Aviv talks about organ donation on page 40 in the top right-hand corner of the page. So she cites Thaddeus Pope, who worries that these disputes, such as the McMath case, which often get media attention, will cause fewer people to register as organ donors, a practice whose social acceptability depends on the idea that patients are dead before their vital organs are removed. So for organ donation to work, you have to have an idea that the body can still be functioning when the mind is dead, and that the death of the mind, the death of the brain, is equivalent to the death of the person. If we agree that organ donation is a good thing, this argument goes, then we need brain death as a concept in order to understand how a body can have good working organs and not be alive. So The McMath case sparked a serious debate about the concept of brain death, which you see reflected in the New Yorker article. But it also raises an important issue discussed in Michelle Goodwin's article of bias in healthcare. So Goodwin talks a great deal about implicit bias, which is simply another word for racism. So implicit bias refers to the idea that some discrimination is unconscious. So the idea is that we all hold biases against others. Racial, gendered, religious, sexual, cultural biases that change our actions in ways that we are not aware of. You can contrast this to explicit biases, which are the biases that we acknowledge and are aware of and are much more on the surface of our behavior. So if you think about 2 weeks ago, Cohen in the hospital, in the TV show that we watched, Angels in America, the patient Cohen is showing a lot of explicit bias, right? Implicit bias is a lot more subtle. So some of this occurs on a macro level, which Goodwin talks about. So on the macro level, it's about the historical accumulation of racial discrimination and how it influences where we live, where we go to school, what kind of jobs that we work, how much money we have, and this in turn produces disparities in health outcomes in different racial and ethnic groups. The macro level, what Goodwin is calling a macro level of implicit bias, is actually typically called structural racism. So if this is a word that you guys have heard recently in political discourse, that's what it refers to. Structural racism is this historical accumulation of racial discrimination. Implicit bias is typically understood to work on the micro level. Okay, so focus on the micro level of Goodwin's definition. That means it works on the level of individual patients and providers. So implicit bias was at work in the ICU at Oakland Children's Hospital when the nurses and doctors ignored Jahi McMath's post-operative bleeding. Both Goodwin and Aviv quote Jahi's mother as saying, "No one was listening to us, and I can't prove it, but I feel in my heart that if Jahi was a little white girl, I feel we would have gotten a little more help and attention." So Goodwin argues that the issue that matters here is not whether Jahi McMath should have been kept on a ventilator for 4 years after being declared brain dead. The issue is that she should not have ended up in a situation where she was declared brain dead in the first place. So think back to the story in Aviv's article of how Jahi ended up ventilator dependent. Why did the medical staff fail to respond to her post-operative bleeding in a timely manner? Goodwin's answer is implicit bias. So following Goodwin, I would like to register the case of Jahi McMath as a protest against systemic inequality. In challenging the concept of brain death, Nyla McMath challenged the definition of death within a system, the healthcare system, that produces the deaths of Black people at much higher rates than the deaths of white people. The operation of racial bias in healthcare defines the ailments of Black people as less important and less worthy of attention, resources, and treatment than the ailments of white people, and thereby defines the death of Black people in the United States as less important than the death of white people. This is what systemic inequality means. It is an inequality that is baked into the system. By refusing the death of her daughter, Nyla McMath refused that system. But that doesn't mean that the answer to this problem is allowing brain dead people to stay on ventilators. This is a protest that should be honored, but it should not have been necessary. Jahi McMath should not have ended up brain dead in the first place. She ended up brain dead because of the racial bias that is ingrained in our healthcare system. Honoring her mother's protest would mean changing the social and economic structures that disadvantage communities of color in terms of access to medical care, and changing the attitudes and behaviors of healthcare providers towards racial minorities. So race is a social construct. It is a biological fiction, a system for codifying the enormous array of human genetic and phenotypic differences that was invented in the 18th century by European intellectuals. It is astonishing that we still use it, but that does not mean it is not real. We have made it real by centuries of use, but it does mean that contemporary medicine should understand race as a social structure with measurable health effects and not as a biological fact of innate difference. So I don't know if you're going to get this elsewhere in your health sciences classes, but it's really important for you guys to know and to recognize that race is a social construct. The doctors and nurses who let Jahi bleed out did not act intentionally. Yet they failed in their duty of non-maleficence. They were negligent. They made a mistake. They made a series of mistakes. And this is what implicit bias looks like. This is what structural racism looks like. A series of mistakes that no one thought they were making. So note how frequently the Aviv article refers to the attitude of the healthcare providers. So on page 33, in the bottom of the right-hand column, Sandra, the grandmother, says that she sometimes wonders if the hospital had been more compassionate, would we have fought so much? Yet the answer is not just compassion on the part of healthcare providers when things go wrong. The answer is beneficence, the duty to care and prevent these kinds of incidents from occurring. So the legacy of systemic racism produces failures of trust in the patient-provider relationship. Justified mistrust of the hospital staff on Nyla's part led her to distrust the concept of brain death. Her distrust provoked a series of actions on her part and a series of ethical and medical debates about the concept of brain death. Yet those debates drew attention away from the initial injustice, the systemic social injustice of racial disparities in health outcomes, which led to Jahi's death. So that's it for this week, but make sure when you are doing your worksheet that you remember the two opposing arguments about the McMath case. There is one argument that I am making here in this lecture, along with Aviv and Goodwin, and it's an argument about social justice. There is also an opposing argument that was made by Caplan and the ethics committee at the Oakland Children's Hospital, which was about distributive justice. Okay, so these are two opposing arguments about the same issue, and you're going to need to outline them in your worksheet. All right, so thank you guys very much for listening, and let me know, as always, if you have any questions or concerns. Okay, ciao.